Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding near the end of the fifth chapter of Tanya. Tonight, God willing, we are going to finish our study of the fifth chapter of Tanya. And then we will, God willing, in the future, go onward and upward. Future chapters of Tanya. The fifth chapter of Tanya is about the study of Torah. The godly soul achieves a yichud nifla, a wondrous unity with God and with Torah, because when the mind understands a concept in Torah and understands it well, it surrounds and is surrounded by the idea simultaneously, which means that at the very same time that the idea is being made one with the seichel, and the idea is being internalized and absorbed into one's mind, one's intellect. At the very same time, when you're studying Torah, the mind is also totally involved in Torah, surrounded by Torah, experiencing the experience of Torah from the outside, as it were. And therefore, the mind is uniting with Torah both from the inside and from the outside at the same time. Only Torah achieves this unity with the mind. Only Torah allows the mind to connect with the thing itself from the inside. And this is the only way that a person can achieve this inner unity, this yichud nifla with God. Nothing else. In fact, as we even began to discuss last week, not even mitzvahs allow a person to connect to God in this way. Other things, other mitzvahs, other commandments allow a person to have an experience of the divine. It allows a person to enclose the whole soul in the divine. But the idea that a person can unite with the divine by absorbing it, can unite with godliness by digesting, changing itself from the inside out, this whole idea only really exists with Torah. And that's why the Alter Rebbe says, in his beautiful lashon, in his beautiful terminology, that a non-true claim from a case that will never happen, that we study in the Talmud, if we understand it well, if we have what the Alter Rebbe calls tfisa, a true intellectual grasp of it, we understand it well with our intellect, with our understanding, then the person has a unity with God that can't be found anywhere else in the world. The mitzvahs, contrasted with mitzvahs, we spoke at the end of last time that we learned that the mitzvahs are much more like an experience of God, right? They're makif. They're an experience from the outside, right? They don't unite, however, with the experiencer to change him from the inside, right? We gave the mashal, it's the difference between being inspired from attending the Rebbe's Farbrengen versus transforming oneself by studying the Torah of the Rebbe. Right? Inspiration from the outside can transform a person, but at the end of the day, it's always an experience that remains separate from you, and it really remains above you, transcends you. Whereas Torah, absorbing Torah into your understanding, absorbing teachings into your understanding, literally changes who you are. It changes the mind that is understanding from the inside. And the metaphor for this is from food, as we're going to discuss tonight. that Torah is literally food for the soul. Why is it called food for the soul? It's not just because it's a nice phraseology that sounds good and warms people's hearts in lectures and reminds them of chicken soup for the soul, or whatever the series of books are called. It's food for the soul because food, the whole process of eating, is a metaphorical process for this idea. The process of eating and digestion, you are what you eat. What you eat literally becomes your own flesh. So too, the study of Torah, the godliness of Torah, literally becomes the substance of the soul. You can't distinguish between the soul's intellect and the Torah that it understands well. They literally become one thing. Just as when a person eats, the digested food, the energy from the food that they've eaten, becomes one with them. I would like to continue reading. We are on chapter 5 of Tanya, of course. We are at the bottom of page 18 in the Hebrew. We are going to start with Ulafi. It's a new sentence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up from the bottom of page 18 in the Hebrew. And then on page 20 in the English, in the last paragraph, since in the case of knowledge. That's where we are. Page 18 in the Hebrew, you see where I am?
No.
Page 18 in the Hebrew, 5 lines up from the bottom, a new sentence, Ulafi.
Yes.
Okay. Zok the Heilige Tanya, says the Tanya Kadisha, the golden tongue, the Shene Hazav of the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe writes, Ulafi should be a dias ha-Torah, and since in the knowledge of Torah, ha-Torah meluveshes benefesh adam, the Torah is enclosed within the soul of the person, the sichla and his mind, umukefes b'seicham, and is enclosed by them, right? Which, remember, if it weren't for the miraculous act of God, that God puts himself into the Torah, right, and puts himself into every detail of the Torah, the whole concept would be impossible, right, of the mind surrounding Torah, because every idea in Torah contains the infinitude of God. How can the infinitude of God get inside your head, right? The answer is only because God chooses it to be so, and it's quite a miraculous thing, because normally speaking, the idea that your head could get around God doesn't really hold water. It's not really a rational notion, right? The idea is God, from his end, decides to put himself into every detail of Torah, right? And since when you know Torah, and it goes within your mind, and is enclosed by your mind, therefore it is called bread and food of the soul, right? The energy of food comes from eating and digesting it. The energy of Torah comes from comprehending it, from understanding it, right? Really, this is what Bina is. This is what understanding is. It's like a process of digestion, right? What's Bina? Remember, recall back to chapter
2,
3.
I knew it.
Close, so very close. Back to chapter 3, when we discussed what Bina is, right? In chapter 3, we discussed the 10 faculties of the soul. So in Bina, right, is analysis. Bina is taking things apart, putting them back together again, right? Really understanding intellectually all of the details of the thing. Well, Bina in the body, very much so, is a process of digestion. In fact, as we're going to see in just a minute, I'll try and remind me when we talk about the pasuk, right? I'll draw the connection for you that Rashi says it's a leiv. We always say leiv lahavin, right? A heart, an understanding heart. The heart is associated with Bina, and we'll actually see that this is connected to a Rashi, which is connected to this Tanya. But the point is that the heart in that context is actually connected to digestion, right? In other words, the whole process of Bina is really a process of digestion. You take something that comes from outside of you, some truth, some idea, right, which is usually presented by Chachma in this very, if we wanted to extend the metaphor and be fanciful with it, we might say, the Alter Rebbe doesn't say this, I'm speculating now, but we might say perhaps that swallowing the food is like Chachma, right, or
Yes.
putting it in your mouth is like Chachma, right? Bina is digestion. Bina is you break it apart, right? And it becomes literally the flesh of your flesh. The energy of that food literally becomes your own energy, right?
So it's already together with das. Because the breaking down the pieces is the bina, and when we make it out of yourself, it's already das, isn't it?
Really, the truth is that everything is with das, is the truth. Is the answer to that question, right? Das is, in a way, you could say that in any metaphor, the fact that you're doing it is the das, in a way, right? In other words, because you're relating to this as a real thing, right? So in the mashal, das is always, but usually one way to know whether you understand das correctly is that das doesn't add anything intellectually, right? And so far, it's interesting what you're saying about das, because actually a little bit later in the chapter, God willing, a little bit later in tonight's class, we're going to talk about Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake, and you could maybe even say that that's an idea of das, right? But if you say that that's das, then if you wanted to speculate that that's das, then it actually has, it's actually kind of in conflict with the idea of bina here, whatever. I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how das fits in here. I was thinking, however, one other thing that I just had this thought preparing the class, that it's interesting that when you eat food, right, the food doesn't magically become your flesh. What happens is that the food really goes to feed, you know that the mitochondria is the workhorse of the cell, as everyone learned in biology class, right?
Again?
Mitochondria.
Mitochondria, yes.
Of course, the workhorse of the cell. I just had to say it in the English, you know. So the food is broken down, right, and it goes to power various cellular processes, right, and it allows the cells to live and divide, and that's actually how we understand in modern biology how food is digested and gives you energy, right, because it all goes towards, it's all fuel for the processes of the cells in your body, right. And what's interesting, this is purely my own idea, but as I was preparing class, I was thinking that really the same is true with Torah study and connecting to Hashem, right. It's not giving you really it's not that it's giving you sustenance from the outside, as it were, right? How does the Torah connect you to Hashem? It reveals the connection to Hashem that you had already, right? It reveals, it's feeding the process that your soul already has of connecting to Hashem, which is that be'etzem it has a connection to God, right? As we said in the previous chapter, in chapter 4, when we were talking about mitzvahs, right? That it's the Torah and mitzvahs are a culmination of the soul's natural connection to Hashem. The soul wants to connect to God by itself, but it doesn't have the wherewithal, you would say in this mashal, it doesn't have the energy or the fuel, right, to connect to Hashem. So the food fuels the soul's own pride. In other words, the soul can do it itself. It just needs fuel, right? So this energy fuels the process. So too, Torah and mitzvahs, right, it's not connecting the soul to God for the first time, God forbid, because the soul is literally one with Hashem, right? What's it doing? It's returning the soul, as we said in chapter 3, really, it's returning the soul to itself. It's giving the soul, as it becomes a finite and defined worldly thing, the ability to get in touch with its own source, right? And that's why you have all these maimarim that we would learn after Tanya, right, that are based on Tanya, which explain the dynamic that really it's the soul getting in touch with its own source elevates Torah rather than vice versa, right? Similar to how we say that the whole point of food, the reason why God makes food, right, is so that it can be elevated and turned into the soul, the aveda, the service of God that a person can give when they can turn it into when they eat food, right? Like the famous Hasidic story about how the sheep used to say ba ba, and now the sheep say Shema Yisrael. You heard this Hasidic story before? No. Long story short, when you eat the food, right? It's a famous saying of a Chassid whose name I forget at the moment. When you eat the food, when you eat the sheep, when you make a bracha, right, and you use it and you intend to use the energy, the Shem Shemayim, right? You take something that said ba ba, as we'll learn when we learn about Klippas Noga, God willing, in a chapter coming up soon. You take the energy that was in this sheep, right, and you transform it into Shema Yisrael. You transform it into literally the praise of Hashem. You're returning it to Hashem, right? And in some of the more profound maimarim, we say that lahavdil, although the Torah, God forbid, you can't compare between the klipa of a sheep and the Holy Torah, but even to the soul being used as part of the soul's aveda, even brings an elevation to the Torah, right? In other words, which is to say what really? It is to say that really, there's nothing closer to Hashem than the neshama, right? The problem is that the neshama, the soul, the Jewish soul, the nefesh elokis, becomes a creation. It becomes distant from its own reality. It forgets who it really is, right? Really, the function of the Torah, the highest function of the Torah, just like food feeds the body's own processes, really the body is alive on its own. It just needs fuel, right? So too, the neshama really has a connection with Hashem on its own. In other words, it's important to remember always that it's not that we're not connected to Hashem without Torah. It's that we've forgotten our inherent connection to Hashem, which you may sound like a slight difference, but really it can be a big difference, especially that a person shouldn't get despondent, shouldn't get sad and think that I have so little Torah, I have so little connection to Hashem. On the contrary, you're already there. You just need to remember what you have already, right? It's a whole different story. It's a whole different story finding out that you have a treasure already buried in your backyard versus I have to go out and earn $1 million, right? It's a different story. So, the food of the soul. The Torah is food because food is absorbed internally. It becomes your own flesh and blood, as the Alter Rebbe is about to say. It continues Alter Rebbe 3 lines up from the bottom of the page. Ki kamei shalechem hagashmi zan es haguf, just as the physical body feeds the body, just as physical bread, feeds the body. He says it nourishes the body for zan, which is a good translation. It nourishes the body. When you take it, mamish, when the body takes it within and deep into itself, literally, the nefach sham liyas damu basar kipsar, and it is transformed there to become the blood and flesh like his own flesh. Right? You can't distinguish between the flesh that came from bread and the flesh that you had already, so to speak. Right? The azai. V'azai yichya v'yiskayim kach b'yedias ha'Torah v'sagasa b'nefesh ha'adam shalom dehetev. Then the soul will live and be sustained through its knowledge of Torah. Now I'm on the next page. Vasagasa, and its comprehension, B'nefesh ha'adam shalom, in the soul of the person who learns it. Heitev, who learns it well. Be'iyun sichloi, with a deep attention of the mind, concentration of the intellect, he translates. Ad shenit peses b'sichloi, until it is grasped in the mind, right? The word grasp, again, indicating this clear understanding in Bina. And the mind unites with it. And they become one. When this happens, right? We're explaining the metaphor. Just as when you put bread deep inside your body, it gets processed and absorbed and digested. So too, when you put Torah inside your neshama and you become totally one with it. What's the metaphor for being inside? Right, you have to totally absorb it, which means you really have to understand it. That's really what it's a metaphor for, right? Then it becomes food for the soul, l'nefesh v'chayim b'kirba, for the soul and the vitality within a person. Mechaya achayim ein soich baruch hu, from the life of lives, the Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the Infinite One, blessed be He. Hamaluvash b'chachmasei v'torasei shebekirba, who is enclosed in His wisdom and the Torah that is within Him.
The life of life. It's
Chaya chayim.
They said it was very specific with every word, and
of course.
Very interesting here with the
it's
the life of the life.
Yeah. It is interesting. It's a term applied to Hashem here. It's definitely a precise term. It's definitely significant. And we see here that in Alter Rebbe's words that in the metaphor, right, just as food feeds the body, the Torah, which comes from the Chaya Chayim, which comes from the very source of life, God, of course, being associated with life in Yiddishkeit. So too, the life of life, as Ronnie says, and more precisely, so too the Torah, which is associated with the life of life, gives life to the soul. The soul is vivified, meaning from the inside, right? The soul is transformed and given life from the thing that it absorbs. I should point out that at a deeper level, or I don't know, at a deeper level, but we should point out that in Chassidus, something being alive is a sign of it being godly. The two things always go together. In other words, and how is a thing alive? A thing is alive through bittul to Hashem. That's what it means to be alive, right? So as we're going to see when we talk about Klippa in an upcoming chapter, right, there are things that happen to technically be alive. What? Macharayim, other ways, over the shoulder, technicalities, all these things we're going to discuss and hope to try and understand properly. But the bottom line is there's things that happen to be alive, but then there's things that actually unite with life itself. In other words, that actually, truly live themselves, right? And those are, in Chassidus, that comes through bittul to Hashem. Things that are really alive are alive because they are merely expressions of godliness, right? They are merely extensions or expressions of the divine. They're nullified to godliness, right? So too here we're saying the soul becomes alive, even though really it seems that this is a mashal for mere understanding, right? It's not really about life. Life is just a metaphor, right? That just as food makes the body alive when it's taken inside and absorbed and totally digested, so too Torah, when it becomes digested, makes the soul alive, right? I'm just pointing out that what that's a metaphor for is the soul being connected to Hashem, which is what life always is in Chassidus. It's a precise metaphor. Connection to Hashem is life. The two things are interchangeable in Chassidus for reasons that maybe in later chapters and things like that will become clear. Says the Alter Rebbe, V'zeh shekasuv, this is what the verse says. This is what the verse says. V'seirascha b'seich me'ai. Your Torah is in my intestines. Tehillim Perek Mem Pasuk Tes. Tehillim chapter 40 verse 9. Connecting the idea of Torah and digestion. In other words, the Rebbe is saying that this metaphor is seen in this pasuk. Now, Rashi says that even the food that I eat is according to what the Torah says. That's how Rashi teaches the pasuk, right? When you say Torah is in my intestines, you say at the pshat level, obviously the Torah doesn't go in your intestines. So Rashi says, everything that does go in my intestines is according to the Torah, right? In other words, I eat only what the Torah tells me to, right? Whereas the Radak and the Metzudas David say that the Torah is in my heart, my leiv lemevin, right? My leiv lahavin, my understanding heart, and the heart is part of the process of digestion. That's what they say, right? Which technically is true, by the way, because all the nutrients are, of course, circulated by the blood to the whole body, right, and circulated by the heart. So the ultimate, in fact, the end, the culmination of the process of digestion, really the point of digestion is that all of the nutrients should go through the whole body, which is spread through the bloodstream. So, in fact, we would, I think, agree. The Tanya has our stempel, it has our seal of approval, it has our hechsher from modern biology, at least the way I understand it. What would we do if it did not, right? But that the heart is part of digestion, right? So here you see that the lev, which is usually associated with bina, is also associated with this pasuk, and the Metzudas David and the Radak, right? So kind of all sort of hangs together, as it were, right? And the verse, obviously, in the most literal translation, is another example where Chassidus is more literal than the pshat, so to speak, right? Where Chassidus says, no, the Torah is literally in my intestines, because the process of connecting to Hashem through learning Torah is like the process of digestion, right? The process of digestion is like that. By the way, just pointing out that the entire process of digestion, with which some Jews are very taken and occupies a lot of their intellectual life, right? You see that even this is explained by Chassidus and part of Chassidus. And if you ever wondered why God made it that the human body has to go through a process of digestion at all, right? And that we live through things that come from outside of us, right? What's the spiritual explanation for all of this, including all the byproducts, the waste products? If you ask, why does the human body produce waste, right? Which is actually a very interesting question, because you have things like the midrashim about the food that was eaten in the desert and the food that was eaten when the sea was split, that it didn't produce waste, right? Rings a bell for anyone? The midrash says that there was no byproduct of the man. The man was totally absorbed in the body. The food of heaven. So in other words, it all derives from the nature of Torah. What's Torah? Torah is a whole mode of divine expression, as we're about to read in the Alter Rebbe, the whole mode of divine expression, which is immanent, right? Which is mamale kolamen, the expression of Torah that comes b'pnimius, right? So in other words, eating food and the entire process of digestion and the whole process of eating something that becomes one with you, right, is a fundamental spiritual concept in Chassidus. So in other words, lots of things, eating as a process, eating as an experience, right? Of course, like everything else, I'm just pointing it out to you, like everything else derives from godliness, is an expression of godliness, right? In Chassidus, there's no part of the human experience that's not part of serving Hashem, right? So the whole process of why human beings need to eat food and why does it produce waste and all these things, it all has to do with the pnimi. It all has to do with I need to take in something and have it become one with me, right? And that's a thing that gives me energy and vitality. This all reflects these teachings of Chassidus. So as King David says, the Torah is in my intestines. This is the metaphor for studying Torah, for absorbing Torah. Continues Alter Rebbe, as is written in the Eitz Chaim, Shar Mem Dalet Perek Gimel, in the 44th gate, the 3rd chapter, Shelavushay HaNeshamas, the garments of the soul, Began Eden, in the Garden of Eden, Hein mitzvahs, HaMitzvahs VaTorah, Hi Hamazon LeNeshamas. This is the mitzvahs and the Torah, which is the food for the neshamas, right? This now we're talking Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah from the Eitz Chaim. The Eitz Chaim explains that it's written in Eitz Chaim that the soul in the afterlife, right? Also, just as a person in this world needs to have food and garments, so too the soul in the afterlife also has food and clothes, right? And where does it come from? The food and clothes of the soul are different manifestations of godliness, are different experiences of godliness that the soul enjoys and benefits from in the afterlife. And where does it come from? It all comes from the avodah that a person does in this life, right? As the Alter Rebbe continues, she'asku ba'elam hazeh b'torah lishma. It all comes from the food for the soul in the afterlife, so to speak. So we see again that the Torah is compared to food, which is really the connection here, right? This Torah is compared to food. The food for the soul in the afterlife is the result of the Torah that it learned in this life, lishma, the Torah that was studied for its own sake, which is an interesting term that we'll discuss in a second. But first, I'd just like to point out that what we call the reward for the soul in the world to come, where it basks in the rays of godliness, we've already mentioned in this class that's really an experience of Torah, right? But here we're really explaining even more precisely that the reward for the soul in the afterlife is nothing other than an experience of the things that it did that serve God in this world. In other words, the reward in the afterlife is not a separate thing, right? Rather, it is the experience of all the goodness and all the godliness that a person was attached to when they were in this world. So in other words, the food that the soul eats in the afterlife is literally the Torah that the soul studied when it was in this life, right? The two are not just connected, it's literally the same thing, right? Because we see here that the spiritual vitality of the soul comes from the Torah that it absorbs and that it understands well. Is everybody with me? Now, what about this word lishma? The Torah has to be studied for its own sake. All of a sudden, there's a wrench in the works. There's this alarming term, right? That the food that the soul eats in the afterlife is from the Torah that was learned in this world for its own sake, right? Where does that come in here? It's actually an anomalous statement. Why? Why is it a strange statement? Because we've learned this whole chapter, and the whole chapter is about intellectual understanding, right? If you understand the concept in the Gemara well, if you understand what Reuven's claim on Shimon in that case in the Gemara, as Alter Rebbe illustrated for us beautifully earlier in the chapter, right? You really, really understand with your bina well what's going on this page of the Gemara. Seemingly, you have united with God. That's what we've been saying the whole chapter. So now there's this mysterious concept called lishma, that you have to learn the Torah for its own sake. Let's read what the Alter Rebbe says about lishma, and then we'll discuss it. Okay, okay, this is written in the Zohar. V'lishma, what do we mean for its own sake? Hainu, this means kedei lekasher nafshe laHashem al yedei hasagas haTorah ish kefi sichlei, k'ma shekasuv b'Fri Eitz Chaim. It means to learn Torah in order to connect one's soul to God through understanding Torah, each person according to the quality of their intellect, as it's written in Pri Eitz Chaim. This interpretation of Lishma comes from Pri Eitz Chaim. It's a Kabbalistic interpretation. I have to tell you that in the Kabbalah itself, there are also other interpretations of what it means to learn Torah for its own sake, and all the more so beyond the Kabbalah. There's even further definitions and meanings of what it learns to learn the Torah for its own sake, so to speak. But here in Tanya, the famous interpretation of the Alter Rebbe, right, which fits beautifully with the entire definition of Torah study and knowledge of Torah that the Alter Rebbe is given in this chapter, is that you have to learn Torah for its own sake, which means you learn Torah to connect with God. Right? There's lots of ways you can learn Torah. The Rebbe says in many sichos, in many places, in many different ways, that anyone can learn Torah. Anyone can appreciate wisdom. We just had Hanukkah, right? The Greeks appreciated wisdom and loved wisdom, but they didn't appreciate Torah, right? Why? Because Torah has to be learned with the idea of connecting to God. There's lots of different ways this is expressed, and there's lots of different ways to do this, and there's lots of different details, but this is the core theme in Chassidus. It's a very important single line here in Tanya, but it's very important. There's many sichos about the concept, right? This is the idea that you have to make the blessing before you study Torah, right? So the Rebbe talks about in sichos. What's the blessing? The blessing before you study the Gemara says terrible things about someone who doesn't say the blessing before they study Torah. You have to say the blessing. You have to acknowledge God, the one that God gave the Torah, before you study it, right? Someone who studies the Torah only as a wisdom, right? That was the Greek way, right? Interestingly, the whole concept is also connected to Purim. You know how?
The blessing of the Torah connected to Purim.
This whole concept of how you have to learn Torah with the intention of connecting to God in Chassidus is connected to Purim.
In what way?
Yeah, Yehudim Hayasa,
Because
which means, what do they all correspond to? I'm not sure if I can do it on the spot either. Erazu Torah, famous Gemara, famous Gemara, right? Erazu Torah, Simcha, Sasa, and Vikar. I want to say one of them is
Ikar is appreciation.
Oh, I know what the translations are, but they all correspond to different
Verses?
no things that the Jewish people do. One is bris,
Ah.
one is tefillin. It's Torah, tefillin, bris, and Shabbos. I think are the four things. But the first one is Torah. Is Torah. I forget the order of the rest, but I think the rest are, as is famously explained, these things refer to is Torah. Then you have tefillin. I forget the order. It's very embarrassing. Tefillin, Shabbos, and bris. Right? So these are all the things that the Jewish people were blessed with, how they celebrated after Haman was destroyed in the Megillah, right? This verse that we say by Havdalah every week, right, comes from the Megillah. It says that the Jews, basically the bad guys lose, and then it says at the end, and the Jews had, because we're in Purim season now, right? Hanukkah's over, heading towards Purim. So the Rebbe has a beautiful sikha where the Rebbe explains how each one of these four things is a way in which it seems like the Jews and the other nations would have been the same, but really they're actually different, right? So in other words, it's four things that ostensibly are shared by the Jewish people and other people, right? But in the end, the distinction comes out, right? And this is very important because Haman says to Achashverosh, what's Haman's reasoning for why he wants to destroy the Jews? Is that they have their own chukim, right? They keep their own laws. They're different, right? So the Jew, basically the end of the story, the Rebbe is saying is the end of the story. How did the Jews celebrate? They were allowed to be different, basically, right? But the Rebbe says it's interesting because each one of these four things, it doesn't say anything like, it doesn't say like eating matzah balls, right? It says four things that everybody seems to share, right? As the Rebbe points out, Torah is wisdom. What nation doesn't have a folk wisdom or a national wisdom or a philosophy, right? He says tefillin is rituals, distinctive dress, right? Who doesn't have a distinctive dress? Well, the Scottish wear kilts, we wear tefillin, right? And you have Shabbos, who doesn't have holidays, St. Patty's Day, right? And you have, and of course you have, what was the last one? Oh, bris, right? All the nations of the world have bris, and most men in America have a bris. What's special about, Jewish body modification? Seems fairly, body modification is in now, right? Everyone's going to get it. If you get the Elon Musk Neuralink, you can get a bris milah. It's all, And what does it denote? It denotes a covenant. Well, lots of people have covenants. Lots of people have, right? You understand what I'm saying? Understand the basis of the Rebbe's Sikha? So what does the Rebbe say about Torah? That's the one we're really focused on, right? The Rebbe says the Torah is distinguished from the wisdom of the nations. He says, what's the difference? The difference is that the wisdom of the nations, when you study the wisdom of the nations and you see how the sausage is made, you see where the idea comes from, what does that make you? It makes you an authority and a yesh. It makes you an authority and an important something in the world of the intellect. You come make a nice big professor, right? And the nice big professor, because he knows exactly how the sausage is made, right? Therefore, there is no fixed tradition by the big professor. The big professor can go and say, well, I know how the sausage was made, and this was a mistake, or well, they concluded one thing, but we're smarter now, so we can conclude a different thing, right? In our understanding, because we know the process, we know how it's made, it's in seichel, right? So the Rebbe, Torah is punkt verkehrt. The biggest Torah scholar who studies all day, Talmud, 20 hours a day, to see exactly how the sausage is made, right? What is that person supposed to come away with? He's supposed to come away with a reverent faith, right? That nothing at all can possibly be changed. And my understanding only makes me more buttle and more humble, that certainly I could never argue with anyone that preceded me, right? We note that not everyone that studies the Torah ends up like this. Why? Because they don't learn the Torah lishma, right? They learn the Torah as a worldly wisdom and not to connect to God. If you learn the Torah to connect to God, right? If you learn the Torah as Torah is meant to be learned, then it doesn't become like that, right? What does the Gemara say in Yuma? The Gemara in Yuma says that Torah, for those who merit, is a samachayim, right? Which means it's a samachayim.
The drug of love.
Drug of life, like a panacea, we would say in English. It's a medicine. What?
Panacea is a cure.
A cure-all. It's a cure-all. It's the potion of life.
Potion.
Right? Whereas a person doesn't merit, the Torah for them is samamaves, right? I don't think the Rebbe would even say. I think the Rebbe would just say the opposite or something like that, right? But the Gemara says samamaves. The Gemara says if you don't merit, the Torah is like a potion of death. So in other words, when the Alter Rebbe is saying, and really the truth is when we were earlier in chapter 5, we already sort of touched on this because we were explaining that this is only true of Torah and not of worldly wisdom, right? Which means, for those who are big chachamim, like everyone in our class, right, you realize you can't learn the Torah as a worldly wisdom. That would be a big mistake, right? In other words, number one, the unity with God can only be accomplished through Torah. Number two, the unity of the soul with the thing that it studies can only be accomplished in Torah. And number three, you have, this is the end of the chapter now, you have the ability to totally mess up this unity if you learn Torah for the wrong reason. Right? If you approach Torah as a worldly wisdom, if you're not learning Torah with your godly soul, but with the ego of the animal soul, right? With the incorrect intention to fix that, with the incorrect intention to repair that, right? You learn the Torah to become a yesh rather than an ayin. Yeah, for yeshus rather than bittul. You learn Torah to become something rather than a nothing, right? You learn it like any worldly wisdom. You don't learn it as the wisdom of God. You have the ability, and it is within your power to reject the unity with God, no matter how much Torah you understand. That's the implication of what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. In other words, there's a condition. It is not purely intellectual, in other words. Or I would put it even in a more precise way, and this is just my preference, right? I would say that the Alter Rebbe's very understanding of intellect, when it comes to Torah intellect, holy intellect, right? Understanding, bina, right, is that it has to be with bittul. If it's not with bittul, it's not truly called understanding it, right?
So before it starts with chokhmah, or in the basement, I start with the intention.
Yeah.
It should start with the intention.
Intention is everything. Intention is key, right? Because the problem is that if you come with the wrong intention, you're not going to, in fact, what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says when Shammai and Hillel would argue, it says in Eruvin, right? Shammai and Hillel would argue the halacha was kebeis Hillel. Why? Not because machadadin tfei. Shammai was machadadin tfei, right? They were sharper, as we translate in English, whatever that means, right? They were sharper. It means they were more intellectually incisive, we would say in English, right? But the halacha was not like them. The halacha was like Hillel. Why? Because Hillel noichin ve'eluvim hayu. Right? They were lowly and humble, and they would always say the interpretation of Shammai before their own. Right? In other words, and the halacha was like them. What does that mean? What does that tell you? At least when Chassidus reads it, what do you see? Right? You see that all the intellectual power in the world doesn't get you to the truth of Torah. It's like a mythological labyrinth, right? You can wander around in there in circles and never find the point if you're there with the wrong intention. If you come to Torah with your own yeshus and you're trying to, with your own ego, and you're trying to learn Torah as some kind of salve to your ego, some kind of thing to make you greater and extend who you are, right? You can learn a lot of Torah, but you'll never get to the real depth. So what does that tell you? It tells you that real understanding of Torah is not like understanding of other things. Torah behaves differently. Torah is a wisdom, but it's a wisdom that practically, the Alter Rebbe would tell you, empirically, whatever that means, right? You could test it out. Torah behaves differently. If you learn Torah but you don't approach it, if you don't learn Torah but don't approach it with bittul, which means you approach it without faith, you don't say the bracha, you're not looking for God, you don't do what you learn, right? You approach Torah planning to learn it just abstractly, without planning to actually have yiras shamayim and follow through, do what the Torah tells you to, right? These are all different facets of the same issue, which is that you're learning Torah with yeshus. You're learning Torah as an ego, and you learn Torah with ego. this unity with God that is accomplished through the knowledge can be rejected. So in other words, what so far in the chapter we've described as purely intellectual, the mind understands Torah and thereby you are united with the mind of Hashem, right? It turns out that it is within the power of the person to reject this unity with God, right? Rather than embrace it. It's your choice. Are you learning Torah for some other reason, or are you learning Torah to connect with Hashem? It's a very important line with Alter Rebbe here, learning Torah for its own sake, and of course there's many different levels. It's not black and white. We're saying it as a black and white for clarity, right? But obviously there's many different levels of Lishma for its own sake, and in the vast majority of cases we would say you should learn for the wrong reason. It's good, don't worry about it, right? But
I've been doing it for years.
But still, who hasn't? But still, the point is you have to know that the real connection with Hashem is when it's Lishma, is when it's for its own sake, which means learning it to connect with God. There's a famous story that when Rabbi Khan, I believe it was, of blessed memory, used to give his Tanya class to one of the Chassidically challenged yeshivas, right? Not officially, by the way. These things were always like underground in the community. There's many stories that come from this Tanya class. I believe it was in Lakewood, New Jersey, to Chassidically challenged Jews back in the day. And these classes were all underground, and there's many interesting stories that came, in all likelihood, from Rabbi himself, right? From his experiences in these classes. So one of the famous stories is that he was teaching chapter 5 of Tanya, right? And he said that he was explaining Chassidus' concept of learning Torah Lishma, which is to learn Torah for Hashem. And one of the students said to him, that's how you learn, that Torah Lishma means, the literal translation of the word Lishma means for its name, right? When we translate it, what it means is for its own sake, right? So the student says, that's learning Torah for the sake of God. What about learning Torah for its own sake? That's what one of the students said, right? And Rabbi there's no answer to this question. Rabbi was just laughing about it, right? Because you're learning Torah for Hashem is one thing, but what about learning Torah for its own sake? Learning Torah for Hashem, that's for the Meshuggah Chassidim, right? What about learning Torah for its own sake, right? Meaning Torah per se, Torah as an end unto itself, right? And obviously in the Chassidic understanding, as the Alter Rebbe has been explaining in the whole chapter 5, what do you mean Torah as it is unto itself? Torah is literally Hashem, is one with Hashem. That's the whole point, right? If you don't get that, you've missed the whole boat, right? So in other words, learning Torah for its own sake means learning for the godliness of Torah, which is what Torah is. There's no obviously, there's no dividing between these two things. The only place where these two things can become divided is if a person learns Torah for the wrong reasons. That's the only thing that divides the Torah from itself, God forbid, and makes the Torah into something that it's not, right? So, Lishma, it's a key, right? It's one of these single words in Tanya that's important, right? You have to learn Torah for its own sake, which according to the Pri Etz Chaim, which is the chosen understanding of the Alter Rebbe, is learning Torah for the sake of God. The rest of chapter 5 is a bracket, is a parenthetical of Alter Rebbe. The parentheticals, the statement of the parenthetical, in summary, is the Alter Rebbe is going to say that, by the way, the Torah has the advantage of mitzvahs as well. In other words, just in case you think you're missing out, Torah has all the advantages that mitzvahs have as well. So in other words, that's how great the Torah is, that you really get both advantages. You get the advantages of mitzvahs through learning Torah as well. As the Alter Rebbe says, food is what's called an pnimi, an inner light. Levushim are what's called a transcendent or separate, apart, or literally, makifim literally means surrounding, right? From the same root as hakafas, like hakafas and Simchas Torah, right? Levushim, the garments, are a surrounding light. In other words, it's not just the Alter Rebbe is saying it's not just a difference in how a person experiences these things, right? Because that's been our main distinction so far. We said a mitzvah is like something that you experience from the outside, whereas Torah is something that's transformative on the inside. The Alter Rebbe says it's not just how we take them. There is a fundamental difference in their in the way that God emanates or expresses these two things. In godliness, there's a difference. The mitzvahs are a transcendent light, a light whose nature is to not speak to and come within each individual thing. What's sometimes called in Chassidus Urhas Sovev, right, which we meet later in Tanya, the surround that we already mentioned it, but we define better later in Tanya, I should say. The surrounding, the transcendent light of Hashem, the infinite light of Hashem, which is not within each given reality. And then you have Mamale, the inner light, which is the inner light of each reality. That's the Torah. The Torah is the inner light of each thing. So these are actually two different levels of godliness. Amru, that's why we say, Amru Razal, that's why the sages say, pardon me, Talmud Torah shakol keneged kol mitzvahs, that the learning of Torah is equal to all of the mitzvahs, right? Talmud Torah keneged kulam, as you may have read somewhere recently in the Siddur, right? What's the simple explanation for why the learning of Torah is equal to all of the mitzvahs? Famous Gemara, right? Gadol Talmud, great is learning because it brings a person to action, which is one of these beautiful paradoxical statements of the Gemara. So which one's greater, right? If you want to learn, is learning greater or is action? We say learning is greater because it brings to action, right? So you could read it paradoxically and treat it as a mystery, right? But at the simple level, it's not so mysterious. At the simple level, right, the idea is that to do any mitzvah, to do all the mitzvahs, you have to know what to do. Where do you learn what to do? You learn it in the Torah. So the Torah is equal to all of the mitzvahs because Torah is great. Why? Because the only way you can actually do any of the other mitzvahs is through studying Torah. So Torah is equal to all the other mitzvahs because every single one of the other mitzvahs, where do you learn how to do it? You learn about it in Torah. That's the simple meaning, right? Of Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The Torah is as great as all the mitzvahs. Here, we're saying the Chassidic meaning, right? Which is, it's not that Torah is great because it brings you to do all the other mitzvahs. There is, lets you do the other mitzvahs. Torah per se, Torah in itself, right? Torah Atma, is greater than than all the other mitzvahs. Why? Lafisha mitzvahs ain't levushim levad, because the mitzvahs are only garments. V'atorah himazon, whereas the Torah is food. V'gam levush lenefesh hamaskela shemislaveshes ba be'iyuna v'limuda, but is also a garment for the intellect of the soul, meaning the godly soul in this case, which is enclosed within it in deep study and learning.
Well, if there's a mitzvah to do Torah, so the fact that you're doing a mitzvah is a level.
Correct, very good. So first of all, there's a mitzvah of Torah study. So Torah study is not just the understanding of Torah, which you've been speaking about so far in the chapter, but there's also the mitzvah of learning Torah at the time that one is learning it.
The rabbi said something in Birkot HaShachar. We have 3 blessings on the Torah.
Yeah.
And he explained that each one stands for something. I wish I could remember what he was saying.
I wish so too, because I don't recall that. It sounds interesting. Continues the Alter Rebbe. So you have the mitzvah of Torah. So Torah is both. It surrounds, as we keep saying, from the inside and from the outside. In other words, you don't just absorb the Torah, you are absorbed by the Torah. Studying Torah is an experience, like an experience of God, like putting on tefillin is an experience of God, right? What's the difference? The difference is that this experience also transforms someone on the inside, right? So it's both milas. It's like you go to the Rebbe's Farbrengen for a transcendent experience which is above you, but that transcendent experience also paradoxically is also absorbed by you and speaks to your exact level at the same time, right? That's what learning Torah is. Changes you from the inside, so to speak, right? Because even going and not understanding will also change you, but from the outside, right? That's the difference. Right. It's changing you from the inside, which means, what do we mean by changing to the inside? It's pnimius, right? Which means it speaks to you at your level, right? We discussed last time we learned that you see that by mitzvahs, everyone does the same mitzvah. Fundamentally, the act of you putting on tefillin is the same as Moshe Rabbeinu putting on tefillin, right? Whereas Torah, everybody has their own understanding. Right? Speaks to your particular kli, your vessel, and transforms it from the inside, right? So Torah has both qualities. Torah is a transcendent experience from the outside, which is beyond what I can appreciate, which is a good thing. We want Torah to be beyond what we can appreciate, right? We wouldn't want to be part of any club that would have us as a member. But on the other hand, at the same time, at that very moment, when it's beyond what we can appreciate, it is the thing that we appreciate and speaks directly to our understanding and transforms us from the inside. It has both qualities simultaneously, which is why Torah has the quality of a mitzvah as well. Finishes the Alter Rebbe with an interesting, I have to admit, to me, somewhat mysterious line. And the chapter on Alter Rebbe says, "V'kol shekain," all the more so, "K'shemoitze b'piv b'dibur," when a person brings out words of Torah in speech, which is the mitzvah, by the way, you're supposed to speak words of Torah that you learn. Shehevel hadibur nasa b'chinas makif. The breath of speech becomes a surrounding light. It is written in Pri Etz Chaim. Well, the Alter Rebbe writes in Torah Or, and he explains. This isn't going to be the most satisfying explanation, I don't think, because the real answers I don't know. But the Alter Rebbe in Torah Or at least draws an interesting connection. He says that, I think it's Torah Or, that we find when a person is trying to understand something, right? When a person is learning Gemara, for example. I used to have a chavrusa like this, Daniel, you should live and be well. I don't know where he is. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. But when he used to learn Gemara, right, and you don't understand. That's what happened. That's most of learning Gemara, right? So you learn the sugya and you don't understand. So what he would do is he was very committed to the speaking method. He would read it over and over and over. Even though he didn't understand, he would just read it and try and think through it as he was reading it. But very often, after like the fifth or sixth time that he just read through it, right, something would fall into place. And Alter Rebbe writes in Torah Or that when a person speaks something that they're thinking about, it allows the seichel, it brings out the intellect in a very powerful way that's not really... it makes the intellect much more powerful than it would be to itself, so that it can understand things that it couldn't understand if you don't speak it. If you speak it, it gives a special reinforcement to the thinking. And he says, so too, when a person speaks words of Torah, it draws down the surrounding light. It makes it an experience that the person is entering into in a much more lofty and profound way. So when a person speaks words of Torah, Kabbalistically, right, this is a citation from Pri Etz Chaim. The Pri Etz Chaim says that when a person speaks words of Torah, it adds to this dimension. It's Mosif in this dimension. It adds to this idea of being surrounded by Torah, that the Torah has the quality of a mitzvah, that it is a transcendent and surrounding light. It's an experience from the outside, right, and not just a transformation that speaks to your level from the inside. Thus concludes chapter 5. By the way, this is a much increased pace. We finished chapter 5 at breakneck speed by our standards.
Only 17 lessons.
And if we continued at this pace, I mean, who knows where we'd end up? But I'm sure there'll be interesting things to slow us down soon enough.
Before the millennium.
Chapter 5 concludes a whole section of the Tanya. Because chapter 1, we began, half of chapter 1 is just quotations and questions, as you'll recall. And I told you it's okay if you forget about them, and don't worry, we're still not approaching an answer to them, so don't worry about that. The second half of chapter 1 is about the Nefesh HaBahamis. It's about the animal soul, the first soul in Israel, right, which we said came from the Klippa and the Sitra Achran. We had classes explaining what that meant and trying to understand that. Then we said, but the second soul in Israel is a Chelek Elokamim al Mamash. That was the beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 3 described the 10 faculties of this soul, its finite and defined worldly being. Chapter 4 described its garments and its levushim, primarily mitzvahs. Chapter 5 described the special case of Torah, the special kind of garment for the soul that Torah is, and all the qualities of Torah, and the unity with Hashem, the special unity with Hashem that is accomplished through Torah. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6 begins. It's the first words of chapter 6, Ronnie. You close your book. V'hinei zeh le'uma zeh asa Elokim. This opposed to this did God create. In other words, we now begin a series of chapters on the animal soul, which again, I think we'll find engaging because it's speaking to things much closer to our common experience.
Let's concentrate on that.
Exactly. So the animal soul will be the topic of the various aspects of the animal, just like we've spent multiple chapters on the various aspects, dimensions, levels of the godly soul. We're going to do the exact same thing with the animal soul. We're now going to do the taxonomy, the categorizing of the animal soul for chapters 6, 7, and 8. 6, 7, and 8 are all about all the no good, very bad, lowly, gross things that other people sometimes
people,
do. Exactly. That other people have to deal with because they have an animal soul. Or as my teacher, you should live and be well, Uri Kaplun in Yerushalayim, always said with your roommate, right? Your roommate is this guy with the animal soul, and sometimes he uses the wrong fork for the fish, right? He has a desire for strawberry flavored cholent, right? That's his taiva. He has a desire for strawberry flavored cholent, and his avera, his transgression, God forbid, sometimes is he uses the wrong fork for the fish, right? So but only your roommate. He would always say, nobody that comes to this class, God forbid, has an animal soul. We're talking only about your roommates who stay back in yeshiva and don't come to this class, right? Because we used to go to his apartment for a Tanya class. So your roommates who stay back in yeshiva, Anyway, so chapters 6, 7, and 8 are about the animal soul and klipa and sitra achra more generally, things that are alienated from their divine reality in general. And then chapter 9, God willing, which for us is who knows what year that we'll reach that. Chapter 9 is about the showdown between the godly soul and the animal soul, and that leads into 10, 11, 12, 13, where we finally get back to and start explaining tzaddik, rasha, and Benini, right? So that's the general plan. That's where we are in the Alter Rebbe's schedule. The Alter Rebbe is still building our reality from the ground up. What we've been doing most of the recent months is the reality of the godly soul, the divine soul, which is much harder to understand. It really is, right? Because the reality of the godly soul is not, as Alter Rebbe writes later in Tanya, is not our day-to-day reality, right? That the only thoughts it should want to have is Torah, and the only actions it should want to do are mitzvahs, is not our day-to-day reality, right? So now we're going to go back and start talking about the animal soul, the biological vitality of a Jew, or as some of us would call it, what it means to be a normal person, right? And then back
happy person.
normal and happy. And then in chapter 9, we're going to discuss why Jews can never be happy despite this, right? Because there's a conflict. There's a conflict between what the godly soul wants, what the animal soul wants, obviously. As is already obvious, and will become only more so. So God willing, onwards and upwards for next week, or if you prefer, onwards and downwards to the animal soul, right?
Onwards and onwards.
For next onwards and onwards. Don't judge it, you're saying. Very good. Very diplomatic. All right. To be continued, God willing.